Hello, so this is the second video of me doing a past paper walkthrough of 2017 Edexcel History A Level Paper 1, option 1C, which is Britain 1625 to 1701. So in this video, I'm going to talk through section B. I'm going to plan both questions again. As I said before, you don't need to do both questions. Obviously, you just choose one in the exam, but I'm going to plan both here. And also just to say again, this is just an approach. Hopefully it's useful for revision. I'm not saying this is the best approach. I'm not saying it's the only approach. Hopefully it's just helpful to, give people some ideas of how to approach these questions. Okay, so starting off with question 3. How accurate is it to say that the social structure of Britain was transformed in the years 1625 to 88? So this is topic 3, social structure. And we're talking about this keyword transformation, transformed. We really need to get into that, and it's covering the whole period 25 to 88. Okay, so I'm just going to get going with this. So as I like to do, I like to start off with the argument. So I would probably argue here that despite kind of social upheaval during the Civil War, I'll just put Civil War, and Republic, the social structure in 1688 was largely similar to that of 1625. Okay, obviously we've got things like the growth of the merchant class, which did change over the period, but overall I would probably argue that, and population growth obviously, but overall the social structure largely stayed the same. As ever, if people disagree or have got a different argument, I'm very happy for you to leave that in the comments. I've seen essays where people do argue that the changes of this period were significant enough to be considered a transformation. You would obviously have to define what you mean by transformed in the introduction. So maybe you could talk about long-term, kind of unprecedented changes, widespread changes, maybe those kind of things. So I would probably structure this essay in terms of the groups of people. If it's about the social structure, I would talk about different groups of people. So I'll probably do poor, women, and then gentry and nobility. You could potentially do it as the factors that caused the change, like war, legislation, population growth, if you wanted to. But to me, it makes most sense to me to talk about the people. Okay, so I've done a revision video on this topic, so I'm not going to go into like the precise details. I'm just going to give some points here. So talking about the poor, you're going to talk about population growth and how that led to the growth of poverty in this period, and we are going to talk about things like the continuation of Elizabethan poor law. And then we probably talk about the Settlement Act of 1662. Okay, and then overall we're going to say, yeah, things did change for the poor in terms of there was more of them. Is it a transformation? Did things transform? That's entirely up to you. Do you think things transformed, or do you think it was more of a continuation of, already existing conditions? Okay, I think I'd probably argue the latter, that it was more a continuation of themes that had been going beforehand. Then I'd talk about the role and status of women in society, and my argument here would be that there was a change within the period of the war and the Republic, as my overall kind of argument is. So you've got Mary Banks commanding Corfe Castle. You've also got things like the Marriage Act and the Adultery Act, both passed by during the Republic. And so these things, at least on paper, gave women some more rights. However, if you know anything about them, in reality it didn't really change social expectations and the way that women were treated very much. However, something that did change things, a small amount, was Puritan and Quaker, belief in women's education, and a good line of argument might be that actually that was the thing that changed the status of women more than anything else. Again, is it a transformation? I don't think the vast majority of women were affected by that, but you could see the seeds of change maybe starting to happen there. Okay, on to paragraph 3. I'd probably talk about different social classes in terms of gentry and nobility and how their fortunes changed. So you've got in 1649, following the execution of Charles I, you've got the abolition of the House of Lords. So obviously the nobility are kind of in decline. You could also link that to the rise of the gentry, Cromwell, Hampden, etc. And also the growth of the kind of merchant class. Okay, so by 1688 there was 64,000 merchants in London, but the Restoration in 1660 really, takes us back to where we were before the war. You've got the re-establishment of the lords, you've got the nobility back in power. So I would probably argue that this is a blip. Something like the growth of the merchant class does change things, but whether you could argue that's a transformation, I'm not convinced by that. But again, if you want to argue that, by all means go for it. Okay, on to question 4 now. So now we're talking about the economic topic. So how significant was the role of the East India Company? Okay, so that's the focus they've given us, the role of the East India Company in the expansion of overseas trade. Okay, so 1625 to 88. So it's just talking about overseas trade. So you're not, in this essay, you're not expected to talk about agriculture, national markets, those other aspects of this topic. It's just about overseas trade. So it's basically saying, was the role of the East India Company the most important reason for the expansion of overseas trade, or was it something else? Okay, so I would probably argue with this one. There's lots of different ways that you could go with this, actually. So this is just, I planned this out, and then I thought, actually, I've got another idea, but I'm going to go with my initial plan. East India Company, not as significant as changes to banking and insurance. That's what I would, that's an argument here. Okay, so that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to run with that one. So East India Company was significant, but it was kind of in its infancy. What didn't have widespread impact, whereas banking and insurance actually was the thing that was really driving the overseas expansion. Okay, so we're going to start off with the one in the question, East India Company. That's the factor they've given us. Again, I've done a revision video on this, which I'll link to in the description, so you can look at these things in more detail. So what are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about trade routes. You're going to talk about kind of spices. You're going to talk about the goods that the East India Company brought in. I would maybe link it to Anglo-Dutch rivalry and talk about how the East India Company was a kind of response to the Dutch East India Company, and you can maybe talk about things like the Navigation Act and link it to Anglo-Dutch rivalry a little bit more broadly, try and just broaden that out a little bit, and you say, yeah, it's significant, it's part of this mercantilist policy, bringing in new goods, increasing the wealth of the nation, those kind of things. But then I would go on to banking and insurance as my second paragraph, which I would, just for argument's sake, going to argue this the most significant. And I think you're going to talk about how banking and insurance led to increased investment. Okay, so that's why, because people felt more willing to invest, and we talked about in the question 3, we talked about the kind of growing merchant class, people more willing to invest in trade and overseas trade. And you've got things like goldsmith bankers, you've got money scriveners, and again, I've done a video on this, so you can check all the finer details of these things out. You've got marine insurance, you've got fire insurance. Okay, you could specifically talk about Lloyd's of London for marine insurance, 1688, and how, again, this led to a growth of investment, and therefore more investment, more money, more overseas trade. It made it more of a reliable investment for people. And then you could compare it back to the East India Company, that the East India Company, couldn't really flourish until banking and insurance had really developed. And then paragraph 3, you could talk about other areas of growth, and particularly I think you could talk about North America, the Caribbean, and kind of triangular trade. And you could talk about how the growth of the slave trade was significant in terms of the expansion of overseas trade, and particularly I would focus on things like cash crops. And again, this is purely from a kind of economic, financial point of view, which is what this question is asking about. It's not about the kind of horrors of slavery at all. So I'd focus on the kind of cash crops and cotton, sugar, tobacco, and those areas of like overseas trade. And then again, you could potentially link that to something like the Navigation Act. But overall, I think you'd argue that those things were kind of underpinned by the growth of banking and insurance. So I hope that was useful in terms of just running through those two questions. As ever, if you've got any questions or any thoughts, any comments, please just leave a comment, and I'll link to the revision videos for the social change topic and the economic change topic in the description. Thanks for listening.